Bore Edith, good morning. My name is Karoline Trollvik, and I'm the director of Riddu Festivala, an international indigenous festival 4 hours north of here. And with me here is Katya-Garcia Antón, who is the director of the Office for Contemporary Arts in Norway. And we will be moderating this panel. But we would like to start off this session by acknowledging and paying our respects to my community, to the Sami community, to the Sami people. We are on indigenous lands in which we are gathered today. Moreover, our relationship with the lands and waters around us have been alive since time immemorial.
Bore Edith, good morning. We would also like to add that indigenous scholars the world over have been making the point for several decades now that we are living and working in what are termed colonial settler spaces, spaces of ongoing colonization. And it is within these spaces that we are conducting this discussion today.
So before we move on, because Katya will give a short introduction to some of the terms that we will be discussing, I want to introduce our wonderful panel from across the Arctic and from across indigenous communities. So it is Bernade, Driscoll, Onstad, who's here and will be sharing more later, and Heather, Igloliorte, yes, and Maria Huhmarniemi, and Tone Hansen, and Máret Anné Sara. Katya. Yes, a few words about this panel first. With what some are calling the increased indigenization of international art today, certainly an increased attention and perhaps empowerment to indigenous artistic and curatorial practices, there are many complex questions to be discussed. The issue of appropriating indigenous images, stories, and music has long been a challenge and is receiving renewed interest in recent conversation within the art field, as has the question of who has the right to speak for indigenous artists' practices and thoughts.
The panel today is titled Indigenous Contemporary Art, but we will not attempt to define the practices of indigenous artists currently, but to address the questions regarding these practices. And with this in mind, we would like to briefly highlight 3 terms that seem to be particularly framing this discussion. And the first term is, of course, indigenous. Indigenous, a term which has been gaining acceptance globally, led by the United Nations. From the 70s onwards, activism and advocacy at local levels across the world by indigenous peoples have led to a platform for human rights of indigenous peoples to be considered at the United Nations. Between 1972 and 2004, the United Nations working definition of indigenous was refined on several occasions to articulate a concept based on ancestry, relation to ancestral lands, cultural continuity, language, and most recently, the right to self-identification collectively and individually. We also have to think that the emergence of indigenous art must be understood, therefore, in parallel to the creation of indigenous cultural, legal, and political structures, which have been designed and aimed at untangling the role of the nation-states, of international law, and indigenous peoples, because they've been historically so intertwined. And such structures include the development of indigenous studies in academia and the establishment of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the UNPFII, in 2000, and in the General Assembly, adopted in 2007, the United Declaration for Indigenous Peoples, major breakthroughs to advocate indigenous rights internationally. The term contemporary. So the term contemporary is deeply embedded in a modernist framework, and we know that modernism has claimed to be in conflict with tradition in its constant bid for the now and for the new. We also know that modernism itself has constructed the concept of tradition to increase its own value against the supposed grain of tradition. But ironically, today, with the current art world's evident obsession with history and the archives and traditional forms of art making, we have to ask, what exactly would the contemporary stand for anyway? And globalization, modernity, and contemporary are all intertwined terms. Modernity has promoted a de-rooted, floating condition across the globe as a contemporary condition. Indigenous thoughts find their ultimate source of values, ethics, justice, and spirituality in the land, and are therefore in striking contrast with modernity. But this focus on place does not undermine that Indigenous peoples exist across the globe and that they have a long history of exchanges with other Indigenous communities across the planet and are therefore international, which is why perhaps the term planetary is more convincing than the term global in relation to Indigenous artists and Indigenous peoples. And now the speakers today will kick off this discussion with short statements, which we will follow with a panel discussion, and we very much hope to be able to open up to the audience for questions.
So the first speaker is Bernade Driscoll Engelstad, an independent curator of Inuit art and cultural history, research collaborator of the Arctic Studies Center at the Smithsonian, Washington, D.C. And she will discuss about opening up collections of Indigenous artifacts to Indigenous communities, as well as issues around urban and community Indigenous art and the shifts in institutions over time. So I will give you this so you have the presentation.
Okay. Would like to thank the Embassy of Norway in Washington for inviting the Smithsonian to take part in this inaugural Arctic Arts Summit. And Bill Fitzhugh, director of the Smithsonian's Arctic Studies Center, sends his greetings. In many ways, I feel as an outsider, an interloper on this panel, for I'm not Indigenous and I am not a practicing artist. I began my career at the Winnipeg Art Gallery as curator of Inuit art from 1979 to 85, working with many of the elders, artists who have now passed, whose work established the international reputation for contemporary Inuit art. And I feel I've come today as more as a witness, an observer of the changes that have taken place over the past 40 years. One of those transformational changes is at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and that is that they are just about to break ground for a new center of Inuit art studies. It will be actually an addition to the gallery itself. Heather has been asked to serve as an advisory on an Indigenous Artists Advisory Panel. It will really be at the forefront of a new generation of looking at and creating and the work of practicing artists. It's a very exciting future that it beholds. As a research collaborator with the Smithsonian's Arctic Studies Center, I've seen tremendous change, more transformations really in the museum world. The Smithsonian's Arctic collections date from the mid-19th century, collected by individuals such as Robert McFarlane, Edward Nelson, Lucian Turner. Some of these extensive collections have been published and others not. But for more than a century, most of the collections lay dormant in the attic of the museum. This began to change in the 1980s with exhibitions such as Inua, Spirit World of the Bering Sea, Eskimo, which highlighted the museum's Yupik and Inupiat collections, and also Crossroads of Continents, which was a collaboration between the Smithsonian, the American Museum of Natural History, the Ethnographic Museum in St. Petersburg, and the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa. The collections have long welcomed Indigenous researchers. And here we have people from the Mackenzie Delta region looking at material collected in the 1860s at a time before this region, heavily populated, was devastated by epidemics, and 90% of the population disappeared over a very short period of time due to the influx of American whalers. Clearly the most ambitious project of the Arctic Studies Center, here again, the collections in the Central Canadian Arctic that are within the collections of the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian, and the building of the National Museum on the Mall. But the most ambitious project of the Arctic Studies Center is a landmark collaboration between the Anchorage Museum to transfer more than 700 objects on an extended loan, returning objects belonging to Inupiat, Yupik, Alutiiq, Dene, and Tlingit peoples to their regional homeland, where they can be viewed, studied, appreciated firsthand, where artists, whether of the traditional arts or contemporary media, can work in a direct and more meaningful way with their own ancestral legacy, and young people can have firsthand experience with the work of their ancestors. There's a reference in the readings that Katya and Karoline recommended in preparation for this panel, and it's the concept of Umista, the name given to the cultural center on the northwest coast of British Columbia to receive back potlatch objects that were once seized by the Canadian government. It's an ancient term describing the return of objects or persons that had been taken often as hostages or bounty in war. And the term also expresses the pain experienced by the absence of these persons and objects and the emotional relief of their return. In thinking about objects, the cultural heritage of Indigenous peoples, long dormant in museum collections, this sense of Umista comes to fore. It's therefore most rewarding to see that efforts in returning and reclaiming cultural heritage stem not only from institutions, but with great passion and devotion from northern communities and individuals. This photograph of Nivissannaq, known as shoefly by the American whalers in the Hudson's Bay in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hung at the entrance of the Winnipeg Art Gallery exhibition, The Inuit Amauti, I'd Like My Hood to Be Full. It was an exhibition that dealt with a woman's parka in which the baby is held in a pouch in the back of the parka. As Annie Nupayuk, who was there to help us with the exhibit, entered the gallery, she stopped short in front of this photograph, and I could hear her catch her breath. This is my grandmother, she said. She taught me how to sew. Fast forward almost 20 years, and my home phone rang. A call from Bernadette Dean in Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, Nivissannaq's great-granddaughter, in search of the beautiful beaded parka that belonged to her great-grandmother and had been hidden away in the storage collection of the American Museum of Natural History. Bernadette arranged for she and her aunt, Rhoda Carrytuck, to come to New York and to view and to find her great-grandmother's parka. But within a short time, Bernadette had organized a museum visit by a team of elders and educators from Nunavut to 5 museum collections in Toronto, Ottawa, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. And with the collaboration of filmmaker Zacharias Kunuk, who was mentioned yesterday as the director of The Fast Runner, they completed a documentary of their visit, What Belongs to Inuit. It's interesting that there's no sense of resistance here. It's a simple claim, what belongs to Inuit. Opportunities for Umista, the return of lost, missing, taken objects abound. One exceptional model lies in the collaboration between the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo and the community of Johaven in Nunavut, in which 16 extraordinary objects from the Amundsen collection are now in the Cultural Center at Johaven. For those of you who know the contemporary sculpture and graphic art of Netzelingmiut artists, you know that shamanistic traditions long played a role in the prominent role in the work of contemporary artists there. And now on view in the Cultural Center is a historical object speaking to that very tradition. Many future opportunities exist for collaboration between museums, local communities, and individual artists and scholars from the North. The question is finding and funding those opportunities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernadette. We'd like to hand over now to Heather Igloliorte, Assistant Professor of Art History at Concordia University, Canada, Turtle Island, where she's Research Chair in Indigenous Art History and Community Engagement. Heather is going to discuss her recent research and curatorial practices, bringing contemporary Indigenous art and community-based exhibitions into focus. And before handing over to you, Heather, I'd like, if I may, to express my admiration for the postscript under your email signature, which I'd like to read and share with you. It reads as so. Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation are recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Heather.
Thank you. Ula, good morning. In Canada, it is customary to begin speaking by acknowledging the Indigenous land where we stand today. So I would like to express my gratitude for you for bringing me here to Sapmi. I am Dr. Heather Igloliorte, and I'm a University Research Chair at Concordia University in Quebec, in Montreal. My mother is a Newfoundlander, and my father is an Inuk. And he's from Labrador, and I grew up in Labrador, which is as you can see in the sort of little green section there, it's the smallest Inuit region of Canada and one part of Inuit Nunangat on the northeast coast of North America. I am a curator I've been a curator for 12 years, and I usually focus on contemporary Arctic art, particularly Canadian. This morning I want to briefly introduce a touring Indigenous art exhibition that I've been working on for several years now, that just last week opened at its second location in Canada. It's called Sakiayuk, Art and Craft from Nunatsiavut. It's a bit of a departure from my curatorial practice, and I'll talk about that as we go through. Sakiayuk means, in the Labrador Inuit dialect of Inuktitut, to be visible. The title of the exhibition refers to the fact that within our region, Inuit have a long, complex, continuous, and contemporary history of producing skillful, masterful, and beautiful art and craft in all media, including basketry, photography, and painting, and drawing. And within Canada, the Canadian art world and the international, within Canada and the international, bye Anna. Within the Canadian art world and the international art market, Labrador Inuit in particular have been almost entirely invisible. The main reason for this can be linked back to 1949, when Newfoundland and Labrador were the last province to join Confederation, and yet we were deliberately omitted, the province deliberately omitted all mention of the Indigenous peoples in that land from the terms of union. So in 1949, when we joined when Newfoundland and Labrador joined Canada, the province decided to omit all of the considerations that existed for all other Indigenous peoples in Canada. This effectively rendered our peoples invisible to the federal government for decades to come. That same year, in 1949, modern Inuit art, as Bernadette knows, exploded onto the international art scene, following a famously sold-out show at the Canadian Handicrafts Guild. Elsewhere in Canada, and I'm really summarizing here, federally funded arts administrator James Houston and others began to encourage the production of Inuit sculpture and later prints and drawings and so on by traveling throughout the Arctic and buying work, providing tools and materials, setting up print studios and artist cooperatives, and then in the south, creating and investing in retailers and markets. So it was a very concerted effort by the federal government to support the development of Inuit art in other territories of Canada, yet Labrador Inuit were completely left out of all of these developments. While a handful of artists from my region have found critical and commercial success and recognition, Labrador Inuit art as a whole is still deeply lacking. In light of the dramatic advances of the field of Canadian Inuit art that it has made over the last century, the near-complete absence of Nunatsiavut culture from exhibitions and collections, as well as from art historical texts, is highly conspicuous. We were not even allowed to, there was one exhibition that left Canada in 1981. It was a basketry exhibition. It went from our province to Nova Scotia to one place in the US. That was the last time that an exhibition of Labrador Inuit art left my province. We weren't even allowed to use, Sonia was talking about the certification sticker that you put on Alaskan Native art. In Canada, we have the Igloo tag. It is on virtually all Inuit art. It authenticates Inuit art, and we weren't allowed to use it in our territory until 1991. The only organization to really begin to involve Labrador Inuit in the broader Canadian Inuit art discourse was the Inuit Art Foundation, and that started really in the late 80s, early 90s, and mostly in the 2000s. This exhibition, thus, presents an opportunity for us to understand the almost hidden history of Labrador Inuit art through the works of 4 generations of artists, beginning with elders and ending with the emerging generation. Revealing the vital yet long-hidden art history of Nunatsiavut and highlighting the enduring resilience of our artists. In the exhibition, whether or not something can be classified as contemporary art is not of very much importance. Although certainly many of the works fall into the Western art historical category. Instead, for me, a major focus of the work is our engagement with the land. Nunatsiavut means our beautiful land, and in the exhibition, we invite visitors to consider how everything in the exhibition, and indeed most of the artwork produced today in Nunatsiavut, is about the land. Whether it is in the materiality, that's not an example of materiality, that's a caribou skull. Whether it is in the materiality, the stone, wood, saltwater grass, and sealskin that many of the artists have used in the show, or photography of the animals that we depend on, our landscapes and night skies, or engaged works that provides commentary about our colonial history and our environment. The protection of our lands, animals, and waters is something that is vitally important to Labrador Inuit now and for future generations. I think that's my last slide. I look forward to discussing on this panel the significance of Arctic art projects such as this one in relation to Inuit Arctic sovereignty, cultural resilience, community-based research, and Indigenous evaluations of and engagements with the contemporary, including other issues that are relevant to the North today. Nakumi, thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's inspiring to hear you, and I'm sure we'll have good discussions. Our next speaker is Maria Huhmarniemi, who's from the University of Lapland and the Faculty of Art and Design in Rovaniemi, Finland. She is also the chairperson of the Artists Association of Lapland, and she will address the question of community art in intercultural communities and the debates art can provoke in the matter of environmental conflict.
Thank you. So today here I'm mainly invited to present the Artists Association of Lapland, and that's where I start with. So it is an association in Lapland where basically all visual artists and contemporary artists belong to in Finnish Lapland. We have 105 members, and only one of them is a Sami artist. Of course, there are other artists who share the same culture as Sami people do. In Finland, also Finnish people can do reindeer herding, and the cultures are very blended. But actually only one Sami artist in the visual arts and in contemporary art. The Sami culture and the Finnish culture are quite conflicted at the moment in Finland. There are more people who would like to be recognized as Sami than are accepted. And there is various Sami cultures, and some of them are like blended so well to Finnish culture that they are not like accepted so much anymore as a Sami culture. So the discussion is very political and quite deeply conflicted, which then reflects to also art and design. And last years, every year we have seen some misuse of Sami identity symbols and Sami design and art. It has happened in contemporary art, but it has also happened in the politics, how politicians have been wearing Sami dresses that are not real, and also in the, for example, in the sport. And while the discussion is so heated, it makes it quite difficult to have like constructive intercultural practices in art and design. It is quite challenging to make, to use the heritage and to create new design, new contemporary art that would be rooted to the culture, but also work in a new language. As an example, I have one installation of mine there where I was studying the question of how somebody who lives in a culture where indigenous people and non-indigenous people and many other minorities live together, how they can build their identity and use the symbols in their own way. And in the University of Lapland, we do run lots of community art practices and art in the villages in northern Finland. And when there is a community where part of the people belong to Sami community and some are non-indigenous, we try to create a space for dialogue and for doing art together. And often in artistic methods that are not based on the modernistic art practice, but rather to art in nature, environmental art, outdoor practices, where we can study the cultural heritage, but working also in the contemporary language. And this has been done together with elderly people, with children, young people, and families. And this is an ongoing practice that we develop as kind of art-based research. While the whole indigenous discussion is conflicted in Finland, it also reflects to contemporary art. So, and it goes not only to Sami artists, but also artists in Lapland in general. And artists are quite often demanded to produce something that is also can be used, for example, in the tourism or otherwise in branding the Lapland. So as it has been referred today, for example, there's a demand to use traditional materials or traditional like heritage themes. And the Rovaniemi, the city where I come from, we have had many politicians and also representatives of the tourism industry who have wanted to have lots of public art presenting reindeer, which is of course like important topic in Finland, but it limits quite much the artist freedom. And one of the artists working in Rovaniemi, Mark Robert, actually made a manifest, "Say no to reindeer art," and that is his sticker over there. But this is a quite difficult discussion as well, because while some of the artists, actually many of them, do share the culture of reindeer herding, they have like lots of meanings to it, and they may find it personally important, and also they would like to communicate and make art to their own people. So it is also a bit difficult to say no to reindeer art, because at the same time you would like put no value there that you are talking about your own culture. Lastly, I would like to talk of this activist art, which is often carried out by Indigenous people and Sami art specifically, but also non-Sami artists in Lapland. And my wish is that there would be more collaboration of artists, non-Indigenous and Indigenous artists who want to talk on behalf of the nature and the environment. We have got huge demand for using the natural resources in Lapland. There is new minings planned, there is like everything threatening the environment. And I think that artists really have to work together.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'd like to introduce Tonne Hansen, who's director of the Henie Onstad Center in Oslo and chairperson of the board of the Arts Council of Norway. And Tonne is going to discuss the role of art institutions with regards to indigenous artistic practices and what kind of public arenas they maintain. Tonne.
Thank you. So I'm going to stand to see if I can do this in 3 minutes. Let's see. Dear fellow travelers, dear organizers and moderators, I'm here first and foremost as the head of the Arts Council. Together with 9 people, 9 colleagues from all fields of the arts, and together with the administration led by Kristin Danielsen, who opened this summit yesterday so accurately, we give support to artists, artist groups, individuals, as well as institutions and festivals based on their applications. We are a governmental body. We are supposed to cover the country as a whole. So, in my day job, as mentioned here, I am the director of the Henie Onstad Art Center, which is a private institution built in a time, it opened in 1968, where the artwork as an object changed into a field of happenings and ideas, and politics just as much as objects in a room. The accurate reactions of those making that institution was to make an institution that could work as a fellow traveler with the artists, meaning the biggest synthesizers in Norway, the first synthesizer, a space for performance, space that could be changed into whatever the artist would need, meaning a flexible institution at its best. Being in charge for a space which is now the historical avant-garde, we might talk about the avant-garde at all, if it's possible to be the avant-garde. Maybe the Sami artists are the last avant-garde. And with a focus on the contemporary art, it forces us as institutional people to be as close as possible with the artist, just as much as the object. And if the institution trusts the artist, you never know where this fellow traveler might take you. This is my lead motive, both being the head of an institution as Henie Onstad Kunstsenter and as working with the Arts Council. We work just as much with people as with objects. I was thinking of a title when I was coming here, and I was thinking of We the People. Because today, as this conference, this summit has already stated, we need a larger we. Not an us that separates us from the others, but a larger we that creates a community. And we need the artists to lead us in that direction. There's an urge to form a community, whether it is temporary, as we do here today, during this summit, a community that can deal with our disagreements, our conflicts, as mentioned here from Huhmarniemi, and that can, nevertheless, give us a larger we. So, what a community needs is good neighbors. And let's think about what a good neighbor is. It has become a concept for inclusion for institutional leaders such as Charles Esche, who is very precise in his definition of newcomers to a country, not to be labeled as migrants or asylum seekers, but new neighbors. So what does it mean to be a good neighbor? Well, any one of us, and that counts for at least most Norwegians who grew up on the countryside, knows how much you depend on your neighbor. You've had your hair cut, sitting on the kitchen counter with a neighbor. You got some fish from the other neighbor because he just happened to have more than he needed himself. There's a question of sharing goods, values, and services. I just learned reading the manuscript or the program for this for the festival that is opening on Saturday, that the Sami people has a word for this. It's called verde, and it's a term that describes the collaboration between the coastal and the mountain communities. And I'm very happy that this term is brought up again, because we need this verde today. We desperately need to create a common ground. And we need this ground in the terms where even ideas are commercialized, where ways of thinking of sharing has become a commercial ground for Uber or Airbnb, where what would be something we would share has even there become something that is commercial. So what do you do as a neighbor? Well, you share. You share across borders. You share ideas, and you open doors, and you keep your door open for ideas. So, one of the most important discussions the Council has had lately, I've been there for 1.5 years, is to safeguard our presence in a greater idea of whatever could be Norway. Not as a physical, geographical framework, but something larger than that. Also including, of course, the Nordic and the international or the planetarian scene, as been discussed before. How can we enter this space and be part of that? Well, we are totally dependent on our neighbors and our friends. And one of the first things that we started working now is to work with the Sami Parliament on a conference in November. And I deeply hope that the Council and the Sami Parliament, and that the Sami Parliament will invite us back, and that we can invite them in again for a future collaboration. Because we do need a larger we, and we need to include ideas and thinking across any kind of borders that are set up, any kind of conflicts, whether Rovaniemi, which is a very good example, I think, is happening. I'm also happy to hear from the former panel that I just visited that we have to talk about territory and what artworks does, what kind of role does art plays in a new kind of colonization of land, as is mentioned when it comes to mining or other issues. In this work, we have to keep our eye on the artist, and it's from the artist we learn how to think. And with that, I think I'm going to leave the stage to the next artist, actually, in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Tone. So to our last speaker, and we've been running for a long time already, so we're almost up with time. But our last speaker is Máret and Sara. And she will talk. She is a Sami writer, she is an illustrator, a journalist, and an artist. She is also the co-founder of Dáidadállu Artist Collective in Govdageno. She represents a new generation of Sami peoples, asserting the rights of her community through her artistic practice. And Sara, Máret and Sara is also currently exhibited at Kassel, at Documenta in Kassel. So I give you the floor.
Okay, I thought it would be a very good idea to be the last speaker because then they would give me a lot of ideas, but I'm just totally confused. So I'm just briefly going to try to explain to you how I work with my practice, what Pailo-Sápmi is, and the mission of it. This is the original Pailo-Sápmi that is placed right outside of Indre Finnmark Tingrett last year. I made it as a cry out to get attention and a discussion and awareness of what is happening in our region and in our community. I find in Norway it's particularly difficult because there is like a common belief that we are done with the assimilation and colonization. We are the most advanced democracy in the world, and Norway wins all the awards for being the most fair country, you know, appreciating human rights, equality, everything. So there is really no room for discussing, for our voices to be heard. We have just recently now had the decision made that we're going to have like Sannhetskommission, like a truth commission, where they're finally going to start to deal with the assimilation, official assimilation of our people. But my problem is that it's still happening as we speak. It's very dramatic, but no one seems to understand or wanting to talk about it. So we have our precious Sami Parliament. Our artists have been fighting very hard, and activists, obviously, just to get Sami rights acknowledged in Norway. And that happened after the last Sami political fight with the damming of the Alta River. As a result of that, we have the Sami Parliament, but we spent, the Sami Parliament, in my opinion, is a mirror of the colonizing system itself. So our people, I think we spent 30 years or more just figuring out now what to do with this, you know. This is not our way of thinking, of dealing with things, of doing anything. So it's been kind of there. It is very highly recognized because it is an official indigenous parliament, but it has absolutely no political power. And we haven't really truly understood the danger of that, I think, until recently, now that we are really fighting the big struggles with industrializing our entire regions, you know, and in the back of that ongoing situation, we now have the forced cull, the slaughtering of our herds. How did we end up here? What is really happening? That's why I had to make this pile when my brother went to court against the Norwegian government. Because the colonization, this is a reference, by the way, to the colonial history of North America and Canada, the North American one, because the aim is the same, you know, by removing our source for survival, then you are very cleverly, efficiently, and very cleanly also just getting us out of the way. But it's also in the Cree aspect, the indigenous aspect, the pile itself was made to kind of anchor the animal spirit to the ground, to ensure that it would stay here, it would never leave, so that you would have a sustainability in your lives and resources. But it's, I lost my thread now. Yes, but here in Norway, the aim with Pile Sápmi was to really open up a discussion of ongoing colonization and how it is actually possible to colonize so efficiently and so cleanly in the most democratic and fair country in the world. How I work is to obviously have my own artwork, with all of the trials. We won two trials already against the government, and the verdicts are actually saying that Norway, by making or designing the national law, is violating our basic human rights, indigenous rights and human rights, like internationally recognized human and indigenous rights. And that itself is a very, very groundbreaking new platform for discussion, especially happening in Norway. I think Norway has an extreme responsibility leading the democracy and protecting, human rights. We are living in a full democracy. Not many people in the world are that privileged. So that way we are putting the standard also for these kind of questions. And someone mentioned documenta. I'm trying to make this quite brief. 1 minute left. So, yeah, this is what's interesting. This is actually not the one I was looking for. Just give me 1.5 minutes, maybe. Ikke nå. I think that was... this is, by the way, Pailo sent me Facebook page. So if you're not following us, please do. Here it is. Spectacles of Documenta. This is what happened when I went to Documenta. I was totally expecting to just disappear, blend in the world's biggest art exhibition with hand-picked artists from around the world. So I wasn't. Yeah, so I wasn't. I wasn't even prepared on how to deal with attention, because I wasn't really thinking to get any attention in this huge and important platform. So when we are discussing indigenous art, because we are trying to deal with quite existential and for us important matters, and then coming to a huge, powerful art scene like Documenta and becoming all of a sudden a spectacle or an object, that is a new experience. And I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about this and what is the best way to work, to not be a spectacle, but to bring the discussion onwards. But besides that, it was really interesting to meet artists from around the world, indigenous artists in particular for this Documenta, and then discussing this local issue in Sápmi that all of a sudden was global entirely. So we have, I think, by combining our artists, it is very interesting, at least in my opinion. But the curators, we have been talking also about Sami curators. The curating is a fairly new phenomenon, and I just wanted to mention that for me, I wouldn't even call it a curator. For me, like that role would be someone leidestegi, like how do you say leidestegi in English? Like someone who just kind of clears a little bit the path so that you don't end up talking about what is indigenous and do you eat reindeers, and so that the facts are settled in good info materials so that we can go on to discussing what we are creating in the artwork. So let's not even talk about indigenous curators. Let's find up something else that would be our own kind of philosophical benefit of that role.
I think that is a beautiful ending to the presentations, because it leads right next to our question. We don't have time to pose more than one question, but we would like the whole group to try and give an answer or to reflect upon. this question, and it is, what do Indigenous artists, when conveying cultural philosophy and political struggles, expect from the way in which their work is framed, debated, and approached without Indigenous notions by non-Indigenous art professionals or audience? It is a very long question. Did you catch it? Did you catch it? So what can an Indigenous artist expect from the debate that would evolve, for instance, at a huge art fair like Documenta? What knowledge, what pre-knowledge of their culture, of their identity can they expect to be able to have their work discussed with attention to the work and not them as a sensation or as an identity or representing an identity? If that made it a bit clearer, do you want to do you want to?
I think it's what are the structural things that need to change also in terms of the mediation and the spaces and yeah.
Do we not need to rethink our institutions in terms of how they operate? I mean, what kind of platform? I mean, an institution in itself is a public space. It creates a public sphere for the artwork. As your work is presented in Documenta, it is entering into an editorial space. Someone edited that. Someone created a discourse around it. And that discourse has to be there, of course, in order for anyone to enter. But we need to rethink how we create that discourse and what kind of space do we need at any given time. And I think that's incredibly important now in the North when we're discussing the possibility of having, or we're actually going to have a Sami art museum. Right? We are. I think so.
Yes.
We're pretty sure. It's going to be one. But what kind of institution will it be? Will it be a copy of, with a huge space for storage and a small space for show? Or will it be the opposite? Will it be like 10% on the surface, or will it turn it upside down and do something else? I mean, we need to rethink what the artist itself needs, I think, or the art. And then we need to rethink the institution, but we can't change it so much that we don't recognize it either.
Yes. Thank you, Máret. You have a comment. And then Maria.
Yeah, I forgot it again. I was just going to comment on, the experience of being in Documenta. I think Documenta now, it wasn't that problematic because the overall theme was what it was or is. And then my curator is Indigenous herself, so she's doing an incredible job to, just by having her complete understanding, and that helps a lot. If it would be like, like a Western big exhibition, then I have no idea, how I would have even started to explain things there. But in this document, it felt very natural, and I think the sum of everything hopefully will end up in a good and important discussion.
Yes, Maria.
Yeah, my comment is that most of the Indigenous artists are trained in the art academies in the same way than any other artists. So in a way, they have learned the language of contemporary art, they have learned to exhibit in white cube and so on, and also to non-Indigenous audiences. But I think that we do need reform in the art universities in Arctic to have more focus on art practices based on the Indigenous cultures.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we're in a critical moment right now. As Bernadette mentioned, I'm leading a curatorial team that's developing the exhibitions for the new Winnipeg Art Gallery's National Inuit Art Centre. and I am co-chairing we actually took the word advisory out at the first meeting. We were like, no more advisories. Anyone who's served on one knows what that means. But the Indigenous Circle, and one of the things that institution is very keen to do is to not just create a new space and, as you're saying, like put in some storage and some performing spaces, but actually to rethink what an institution is that is an indigenized institution. And that's a process, not an endpoint. But how do we do that? And can you have an Indigenous art gallery that has a board that is all white? Can you have a Indigenous art gallery that isn't staffed primarily by Indigenous curators? And so there's a lot of things that are just now at the beginning processes for that institution, but it's something that the Canada Council for the Arts has recently made a priority, which is ensuring that institutions that avail themselves of funding for Indigenous arts and support Indigenous artists don't just have artists involved in the institutions, but that their staffing is Indigenous as well, and that their boards are Indigenous, that their audiences that they're reaching out to are also Indigenous. And so prioritizing that on many different levels and really making it a structural thing. And maybe rethinking, for example, what's the name for how a board, what's the order of, what's that called? The rules of order, like rethinking the rules of order, the Robert's rules, rethinking Robert's rules, because that in itself is it's a colonial structure for how to relate to your colleagues or to build consensus. So really going down to all of the structural aspects of an organization and not just thinking bricks and mortar, but philosophically and for the future.
Well, I think with that, and since we're running out of time, perhaps just one word of conclusion for everything that you said. There seems to be a real interest and a real urgency to actually forward Indigenous methodologies as a way to create those spaces and to create that empowerment and a stronger and richer, actually, conversation across the board of communities. So I think on behalf of Karoline and I, please join us in giving a very warm round of applause to our fantastic speakers today.